Hi out there, people. Welcome back to Nicholas Studios. This might be the first video I'm making after I've reached 1,000 subscribers here on YouTube. So to my 1,000 subscribers, I'd just like to say thank you so much for your continued support, and I will continue making videos and putting them out here on YouTube for the foreseeable future. Maybe not quite as many as I put out in 2024, but I'll try and keep it at a nice steady pace and bring you the fantastic content you know and enjoy, so keep an eye out for it. Anyway, without further ado, let's get on to today's topic, which is a recent controversy in the speculative fiction realm, that being Neil Gaiman and the accusations leveled against him. So, let's talk about it.
Can't see very far ahead of yourself, but every now and again, the mists will clear.
I was inspired to make this video when I saw yet another video about art versus the artist. And I've spoken about this before, but every time some artist is exposed as being a rapist scumbag or a domestic abuser or the like, usually the argument made is that we should separate the art from the artist. We should be able to enjoy the art, in this case obviously like Coraline or The Sandman or American Gods or whatever, without supporting the artist, Neil Gaiman. As I think I said in my previous video on the subject, I think it was a video about Justin Roiland, when the whole Justin Roiland drama happened, I disagree with this sentiment. I don't really think you can consume art without at least supporting the artist or kind of getting behind the artist, because art is a reflection of the people who create it. That is an unavoidable and intrinsic piece of art, at least genuine art. Good art is a reflection of the people who create it. Maybe not something like Wish by Disney. Maybe that movie isn't a reflection of the people who create it because it's a homogeneous corporate product, but good art, and it's debatable as to whether Rick and Morty or The Sandman fall into this category, but art that really speaks to people, from people, is a reflection of the person who created it. And in Rick and Morty's case, where Justin Roiland is the auteur, or The Sandman, where Neil Gaiman is the auteur behind it, and they want to be attached to these products, you look at The Sandman and you go, that's a Neil Gaiman thing. I think The Sandman can be judged as a reflection of Neil Gaiman's thoughts and ideas and opinions about the world. I think the same applies to Rick and Morty. Rick and Morty reflects the opinion of a socially maladjusted Californian neckbeard, and The Sandman reflects the opinion of a 60-year-old British stuck-up elitist who thinks that he's entitled to everything. I think these two pieces of art very accurately reflect the viewpoints of the guys that made them. So I don't really see any reason why we should separate the art from the artist in this case. Nonetheless, that's the argument that gets tossed around, that you can enjoy art without directly supporting the artist. And even if you don't support the artist monetarily, you are still consuming the ideas of a rapist, and do you really want to do that? Like, you can if you want. You can read Neil Gaiman till the cows come home. I don't think his book should be banned or anything, but ultimately, yeah, his work does kind of reflect the perspective and viewpoint of a rapist, because that's what he is. So you could just read the books of someone who has never done anything like that, or you can keep on reading Neil Gaiman. It's up to you. Make your own decisions. You have free will. Anyway, let's get into the meat and potatoes of exactly what it is that Neil Gaiman did. So in 2022, this is the most prominent incident, although there have been lots of others. Neil Gaiman, who at the time, if I recall correctly, was 60, had sex with the nanny of his children. He hired this woman to take care of his children, so keep in mind, he's already copulated with someone else, and he's had children. Don't forget, he's literally reproduced. And then he hires someone to take care of his children because, being their father, he can't be arsed to just, take care of them himself. No, he's too weak and pathetic for that. So, he has to have sex with the person he hires to take care of his children for him. I think this speaks to sort of a lack of character on his part. Correct me if I'm wrong. I could be wild, but I think Neil Gaiman is kind of an unethical type guy. and he's kind of a scumbag to pay this lady to take care of his kids, and that's kind of a false pretense. Oh, take care of my kids. And then while she's trying to take care of his kids for him and he's paying her, just keep in mind he's immensely powerful and he has a shit ton of money, he says, come on over here and let's have sex. And she's like, eh. And it's come to light 2 years later. But I don't really think that a 60-year-old should be having sex with 20-year-olds, say. I think that's a little too big of an age gap, personally. Now, if she didn't mind it, and it was consensual, they are legally both adults, that's okay. But if she did mind it, and in retrospect she feels that, say, he's used his power as a millionaire fantasy author to, have sex with her, when really she wasn't a hired prostitute or anything, she was a nanny for his children. In retrospect she sees that and says, yeah, this was kind of fucked up. Then I think she's well within her right to take him to court over that, or say, yeah, this is kind of wrong. Maybe guys like this shouldn't be some of the most respected authors in the world. He's kind of a flawed, miserable sack of shit. And I would tend to agree with her on that front. I think it's great that Neil Gaiman is finally getting his comeuppance. Now, I should mention here that I've never liked Neil Gaiman's work. In fact, I think there's an old episode of my podcast where I directly make fun of Neil Gaiman's comic, The Sandman. I think it's one of the most boring style-over-substance type comics ever written, in the same vein, roughly, as Watchmen. Just deconstructionist drivel all the way down. I think the Sandman is a stupid character. I think Good Omens, in particular, is a ridiculous franchise. Just stealing the thunder of a reasonably well-made 70s American religious horror movie and saying, what if it was silly and like Monty Python? We're not exactly dealing with a transgressive genius here when all his characters are from the fucking Holy Bible, the world's most boring book. Like, we literally have a guy here whose franchise is called Lucifer. Oh boy, we're really getting some new characters here, aren't we? Yeah, the fucking devil. I've never heard this story before. Fantastic. No, let's not adapt Beowulf. Let's not adapt the Worm Ouroboros. Let's adapt the Holy Bible. Yeah, Neil Gaiman really is a visionary when he has characters like the devil in his media. Man, it takes a genius to come up with a character like that. Next thing you know, he's going to be coming up with the character Jesus. If you couldn't tell, I do have a bone to pick with Neil Gaiman. I don't like British fantasy authors, except for Tolkien. I do like Tolkien. I think Lord of the Rings is indicative of a self-awareness and a nuance and complexity that no fantasy book since, even something American like Game of Thrones, has been able to match, and certainly no British fantasy. Neil Gaiman is no fucking Tolkien. And whereas Tolkien explicitly says he doesn't want to put Christian crap in his work because he has a fucking imagination, and he's able to come up with this fantastic world that's divorced from ours and isn't just shitty propaganda, Neil Gaiman says, no, I'm going to work the entire Christian theology into my stories. I'm so imaginative, aren't I? And I really just don't think authors like Neil Gaiman, Douglas Adams, Terry Pratchett are all that imaginative compared to the American authors like Harlan Ellison, Joanna Russ, those type in the 1970s. I think that was a real wave of imagination, and I don't think Terry Pratchett compares. I think American authors are far more willing to transcend the boundaries of what's possible and explore interesting ideas through their work. And I've never liked Terry Pratchett or Neil Gaiman or any of that sort of thing. I think it's extremely reductive. All the analogies are so straightforward. I mean, it's not like Lord of the Rings where there literally is no analogy, and it feels so liberating to just read an epic fantasy with wizards and elves and shit. No, in Terry Pratchett's work, everything is a joke. Everything is some kind of commentary on the modern world. What I find weird is the same people who complain about the woke infecting modern media. Oh, everything is an analogy. Oh, it's so much racial representation in modern media. Oh no, they put put a black character in this movie or whatever. These same type people who complain about allegory being overused in modern media, they eat Terry Pratchett's shit up, and it's never made any sense to me. They really like Terry Pratchett, and I don't get this guy at all. Same with Douglas Adams. I think Dirk Gently is ass literature. Like, this shit is overrated to hell and back. I'd like to see an adaptation of a genuinely good Harlan Ellison story, like Flop Sweat, but instead, all we ever get is just, here's Discworld Season 7, here's Dirk Gently's holistic detective escapade on DVD. And I'm kind of tired of all these British guys getting all the credit for all the speculative fiction when I think American authors are pretty damn good too, and I'd like to see more of them get some props. Really, the reason I dislike Neil Gaiman has nothing to do with these recent allegations. Before all that, I read a book of his called On Writing, not to be confused with the Stephen King book of the same name. This is a much shorter, less informative, less helpful, little illustrated book. It's not like 90,000 words like Stephen King has to say on writing. It's about 50 pages, more or less, and it's just comprised of 3 really simple little stories that Neil Gaiman tells about how to write or how to get into the industry or whatever. And reading this book, he came off as extremely out of touch, because he's writing from the perspective of someone who lives in Britain to begin with, which is such a tiny-ass country that everyone in it knows each other and can make connections with each other. Like Alan Moore knows Terry Pratchett, knows Douglas Adams, and they all get together at parties and shit. And that can't really happen here in America, obviously. As a Denver author, I don't know any other authors locally who are like powerful or can give me big connections in the industry or whatever. There is basically no publishing industry here, certainly not like Simon & Schuster or HarperCollins or any of the coastal publishing houses. But Neil Gaiman never considers that his British citizenship, his being in a tiny concentrated little country like Britain where everyone knows everyone else and there's only like 5 really celebrated authors at any one time, might have impacted his climb to the top a little bit. He doesn't consider that maybe that might have given him a leg up. He doesn't really consider anything from the American perspective. He doesn't consider that in Britain, getting famous is really simple because anything will go on the BBC. They have no real standards of quality there. They'll put Miss Marple's bakery adventure on, and that runs all day. So something like Coraline or whatever, yeah, I bet that's a hit over there. Speaking of Coraline, I've really never liked Coraline. Not only do I think Henry Selick is an overrated Tim Burton ripoff, like I've said before, but even if I have to commend the stop-motion work that goes into the movie, the story itself is really fucking dumb. Like, this girl's unlikable in every conceivable way. She's like, I don't like my parents. I want to go live with my other parents in the spooky dimension because I'm goth. Yeah, this is really a character I want to follow around. Not the Nightmare Before Christmas, miss me with that. I want Coraline. This is the type of character that's really worth following around. Yes, please, more of this. So, this On Writing book was very out of touch, and one part in particular really solidified that for me. It was where Neil Gaiman, I guess this was around like early 2010s when the Amazon Kindle was really taking off as an alternative to reading physical print media and books. You could get it downloaded onto your Kindle. I do remember that was a pretty prominent trend back in those days when electronic ink was first made a viable technology. And Neil Gaiman says, do I believe that in the future you'll read all your books on a tablet? No, not necessarily. And then he goes on in this big pretentious speech about how, like, you know, books are great and not all books are meant to be read on a computer. And it's like, yeah, no shit, Neil. Not every book is meant to be read on a computer. No books are meant to be read on a computer because reading an entire-ass novel on a screen hurts your eyes. Maybe not so much with electronic ink, but certainly on an LED monitor. Reading stuff on a page is way more pleasant. I don't know who reads books on their fucking tablet. I know audiobooks are popular, but I don't know anyone who still uses a Kindle or anything. that trend has already kind of been phased out. So that showed me how short-sighted Neil Gaiman is to even assume that actual print media, like text stored on a physical piece of paper, is going to be replaced by the fucking Kindle. Yeah, Neil, give me a break. I'm pretty sure books are going to be around for millennia to come. They're a pretty useful way of storing information. That shit really got me giggling. Suffice to say, Neil Gaiman's book on writing is really useless. He has no valuable information for a young starting author who's looking for advice in the field, how to, say, submit a manuscript to a publisher, which is very helpful information because manuscripts have to be formatted in a very specific way. I know this because I've submitted some of my sci-fi short stories to a magazine on the coast, and they insist that you have certain spacing, a certain font point, and all that. And even though I think a lot of these rules are silly and archaic, it would be helpful if Neil Gaiman, who's one of the biggest successes in speculative fiction today, used his book called On Writing to kind of outline how publishers might want a manuscript or how to mail them back and forth. But no, he just goes on pretentious tirades and then hires someone to doodle little illustrations in there for him. They're not even his illustrations. If Kurt Vonnegut can illustrate Breakfast of Champions, Neil Gaiman can illustrate his own fucking book. Like, what a hack. Anyway, this book really put a sour taste in my mind for Neil Gaiman. Even if pre-established, I didn't like any of his books beforehand. I thought his books were hella overrated. Reading this On Writing treatise really solidified for me that Neil Gaiman is not to be taken seriously as an authority of any kind in the speculative fiction arena. He's just a guy who happened to get ridiculously lucky, and his success story is by no means indicative of the potential of the speculative fiction market today. Neil Gaiman has like this boomer mindset where he doesn't actually have anything substantive of value to offer to Gen Z or Gen Alpha who might want to enter the sci-fi marketplace and offer up their ideas to potential buyers, because he just assumes that the market is doing great because it's doing great for him. Well, here's the truth, Neil. Speculative fiction is falling apart at the fucking seams. Nobody has any idea what to do. Science fiction hasn't been popular in years. Not fantasy, mind you. Fantasy's pretty popular, but suppose you want to write good, hardcore science fiction, you know, like Harlan Ellison. That's difficult to do. It's very difficult to make a living selling short science fiction stories in 2025. But here Neil Gaiman comes along and is like, well, I grew up in the 80s, so it was easy for me. It's like, well, cool for you, Neil. It's cool that you grew up in the 80s when speculative fiction was still appreciated and consumed, but right now it's facing an economic crisis, and people are struggling to make a decent wage selling their science fiction stories. So, less boomer advice, please. More actual useful talk. Let's stop getting our advice from Neil Gaiman. I really think Neil Gaiman isn't so much the problem there. I do think that there is just a generational divide, a severe disconnect between older people and younger people today. And older people don't seem to recognize, like, just the mental health rigmarole crisis blizzard that Gen Z and Gen Alpha, and to a lesser extent some millennials, are currently embroiled in, and how detrimental that is to the state of fiction or creativity. Anyway, the reason I wanted to make this video is because as of late, I've been having somewhat of an existential crisis of my own surrounding the nature of sexual behavior in human beings, and whether or not it negates free will. I hear about sexual intercourse all the time, and it makes no sense to me as an asexual why someone would actively prefer sex. It sounds like a boring and meaningless activity, but I suppose to perverts like Neil Gaiman, he just can't resist having sex with his 20-year-old nanny. And I really think this is an attitude we ought to get rid of. I don't know, but I don't really like Neil Gaiman so much. I mean, to be 60 and to look at a 20-year-old, you know, someone who's 40 years younger than you, and to say, well, sex is great, time for sex now. How does Neil Gaiman even have a libido at that age? Don't most people just, like, stop after a certain point? What I really dislike about this whole Neil Gaiman controversy is that it will put male feminists in a bad light. already I've seen lots of tabloids going on about how you should never trust a male feminist who says that they believe in women's rights and bodily autonomy for women and the like, because it'll probably just be like Neil Gaiman. Because Neil Gaiman has said some kind of puff piece about, oh, I believe in equality for women and all this before. And obviously his work kind of reflects this whole progressive bent, even though being progressive for a British person is very different than being progressive for an American person, because they live under a monarchy. So to them, progressivism is like center-left for us. It's very austere, tea-drinking type stuff. He does present himself as a male feminist and say, oh, always believe all victims, and now that's really coming back to bite him in the ass. But what I dislike about it is a lot of people now won't believe male feminists if a guy says, I believe in women's rights. I think, though, that women should be cautious around so-called male feminists, and the best way to do that is to determine whether the guy in question is capable of sexual attraction. Like, for instance, I'm asexual, and I do consider myself a male feminist. I think that women have a lot of potential. I've read a ton of great literature from women, and I think that potential has been subdued for far too long. And I think that they could write a lot if men weren't constantly asking to have sex with them, which I consider to be a massive waste of time. So I think that to push for women's equality and basic civil rights is a very important cause. But most importantly, I will never have sex with any girl or consider her my girlfriend. So that's not really a problem for me. But there are a lot of male feminists who just say that they want equal rights for women, and then they just go on to have sex with those women, thereby subjugating them and commodifying them. So if you run across a male feminist like that, like Neil Gaiman, for instance, who will hire you to take care of his children before having sex with you instead, that's not a male feminist. That's just someone who wants to have sex with women. Really, I think the solution to a prominent rape culture where we just have all these powerful men abusing their position in the world and taking advantage of young women to have sex with is to deprioritize sex. Really, authors like Neil Gaiman should be far less focused on having sex and more focused on writing fucking good books. I value art way the fuck more than I would ever value something goofy like sex, which I consider to be a banal nude game that people play with each other. So I will never be caught up in a scandal like Neil Gaiman has. He's really just screwed himself over ridiculously. But I have to wonder, how can someone just not resist sex? It seems like such a pointless behavior that only creates trauma for people. And to not even consider that you would be creating trauma for this nanny who you hire to take care of your fucking kids and then are like, oh, time for sex with this person now. To not consider the mental repercussions of that, to treat sex like a casual thing that you can just do one afternoon and then forget about, I don't think that's exactly healthy. I think sex ought to be treated with some gravity and weight, and not as something like casual. It seems like a rather traumatic experience. Not for me, because I'll never have it, so I'll never even know what it's like. But to anyone out there who comes across a male feminist like Neil Gaiman, who's 60 and openly admits that he experiences sexual attraction, I probably wouldn't believe that. Like, if you experience sexual attraction at 60 towards 20-year-olds, I don't think you have any business calling yourself a male feminist, because you clearly are incapable of just letting 20-year-old women do their own thing and living their own lives beyond you. Recently, I was attacked and humiliated publicly by a group of bigoted allosexuals who discriminated against me on the basis of my sexual orientation, and that really hurt me. I might have PTSD now. I almost had a heart attack, and it was very difficult. That was a very unpleasant experience for me, and I am very confused by the anti-asexual stigma in the world today. I think that asexuals like myself offer a fascinating perspective because I don't understand why sex happens or why people have it, having no sexual motivation myself. So I'm confused by what Neil Gaiman did, but I do think it's safe to say that what he did is severely immoral. And we should hold him accountable for that, and he probably shouldn't be able to sell so many whoppers of books anymore, and should probably just go home and drink some tea and crumpet and cry to himself. But he's absolutely not an admirable figure or someone who should be idolized or placed on a pedestal above everyone. I don't really think that Neil Gaiman has produced anything much of value. I don't like any of his fantasy stories. I think he's extremely pretentious. And I don't like how he's sexually attracted to the point where he allows that to control him, and he just does terrible things to people. I think that means that he has a weakness of character that not everyone necessarily does, but if we do want to reduce instances of sexual and domestic abuse like this in the world, we ought to deprioritize sex. It's not that big a deal, and art and writing are way more important. Much more worth pursuing than 5 minutes of sex with your nanny who you hired to take care of your children, who's 40 years your junior. That's not really a pursuit worth caring about. I have no idea where Neil Gaiman's priorities lie. One thing is for sure, though, he's a complete fucking idiot. Anyway, you might come away from this video assuming that I dislike all men, or I hate all male fantasy authors, or male science fiction authors, and I think we shouldn't have a male perspective in the speculative fiction arena today. That's not true at all. It's just that we place far too much of an emphasis on sex in the modern world, and we ought to give a voice to some men like myself who don't experience sexual attraction. There are a lot of male figures in the literature canon that I think are worth reading and have an immense deal of respect for, and not all of them are even asexual. I like William S. Burroughs a lot. Even though he shot his wife, I think that Naked Lunch paints a very sympathetic picture of him, as does the movie adaptation, and he was a very smart, literate, and well-read guy who knew way more than Neil Gaiman, and was an all-around cool dude. Same goes for Hunter S. Thompson. I have nothing but respect for Hunter S. Thompson, and I think more guys today ought to strive to be like Hunter S. Thompson, live by their own rules instead of doing what the world tells them to do. Jack Kerouac, too. I like Jack Kerouac a great deal. I think his writing is invaluable. It's very good. And he was pretty gay, too. I mean, technically bi, but he was very gay with a lot of the Beat generation. A lot of them were openly homosexual. I think a lot of guys today should be more like that and less like, oh, I value having sex with a girl above all else, because that type of attitude is pretty annoying. And you can tell that Jack Kerouac was a pretty well-adjusted figure of his time who openly embraced the world and just enjoyed life before his premature death. So I do have a great deal of respect for Jack Kerouac. And like I said, I even have respect for an author like Harlan Ellison. His work has far more potential and scope than someone like Neil Gaiman's, even though a lot of people, in retrospect, have labeled him a misogynist for his writing and the scenes of sexual assault against women in his work, like in A Boy and His Dog, which isn't even my favorite Harlan Ellison story. I think he's done much better. I have to admit that some of Harlan Ellison's writing, like for instance, How's the Nightlife on Cisolda, has influenced my perspective on sex a great deal. That story is a fantastic exploration of the futility and meaninglessness of sex, and it's the type of thing that only imaginative science fiction can adequately portray. That's a great story if you've never read it. How's the Nightlife on Cisolda? Way fucking better than Good Omens or American Gods. That shit can get tossed out the window straight into the dumpster. Go for How's the Nightlife on Cisolda for a decent exploration of why I consider sex a meaningless and futile behavior. And Harlan Ellison, like I said, wasn't even asexual. He was just that interesting and that capable of exploring alternative perspectives on how sex works. So, I think he's pretty cool. And honestly, I think we should encourage speculative fiction authors, if they do have sexual tendencies, to explore that through fiction in a healthy way, by writing scenes that maybe don't accurately show what they would do in reality, but it's a nice emotional outlet that they can turn to, like in Harlan Ellison's case, who seemed to be relatively scandal-free throughout his life, except when he was plagiarized once. Not so much support sanitized, pretentious fantasy trash like Neil Gaiman, who's all like, yeah, I'm for equal women's rights, but I bang my 20-year-old nanny, and I love equal rights, but I only write about that in my books, and in my real life I'm a complete and total ass. I don't think about the consequences of my actions at all, and I'll have sex with anyone I want. I think we should have more speculative fiction authors like Harlan Ellison that explore sex in a healthy way via fiction, rather than like Neil Gaiman, where all his work is clean and sanitary, but he really does some depraved things behind the scenes. Harlan Ellison, from everything I know, ended his life relatively scandal-free, like I said, and I think there should be more authors like that who write stories about sex, like How's the Nightlife on Cisolda, that don't get just classified as erotica and shuffled off to the erotica section, because stories about sex aren't necessarily erotica if they examine sex from a very detached, neutral, third-party type perspective. Again, Harlan Ellison wasn't even asexual, but he was able to view sex from the perspective of someone else who wasn't as much into sex, even though he himself very much was, which I think is very cool, to have that level of perspective and to be able to detach yourself from your own lived experience. That is kind of a necessary thing for a writer to be able to do. How's the Nightlife on Cisolda isn't at all a very erotic story. I can't possibly imagine finding it stimulating or anything. It's just really a wake-up call as to how, at least I view sex. I read that story at an extremely young age, and it's left a definitive impression on me, I'll just say that. I've gone on long enough about it, and I'm certainly not going to spoil it. If you've never read it, it's fucking fantastic, and you should go read it. Anyway, yeah, we need more sex in fiction. We need to view sex more as a fictive, imaginary thing, and less as a real thing that we can just, like, actually do. Like Neil Gaiman, he'll just have sex willy-nilly whenever he pleases, and he assumes that his millions will defend him from that. He's completely out of touch with reality. And I think someone like that certainly shouldn't be idolized. He's incapable of controlling his body. Why would you trust him to write a competent novel? Anyway, I am extremely disappointed by the recent backlash against me on the basis of my asexuality, and I feel that a lot of allosexuals are very hostile towards me as an asexual, specifically because I'm incapable of experiencing sexual attraction or understanding how it feels or what it is or why anyone has sex. But ultimately, you shouldn't be anti-asexual if you're a self-proclaimed male feminist or you actually think that people should have bodily autonomy, because the best way to have complete bodily autonomy is never to engage in sexual or romantic behavior of any kind and to live every day as a sovereign individual the way that I do. If you're actually against stuff like sexual assault, domestic abuse, and all of that horrible nonsense, then you have no beef with asexuals, and you have no reason to be afraid of asexuals. There is no demographic less likely to do something absolutely vile and horrible in relation to sex than asexuals. In fact, asexuals are far more likely to be the victims of harassment, discrimination, or sexual violence, such as corrective rape. I learned that the hard way when, this very week, I was harassed by an acephobic hate group who actively and openly discriminated against me on the basis of my sexual orientation. At this point, I've basically made peace with the fact that I am a disenfranchised person, and my civil rights will be violated on a regular basis. And that's just something I have to live with as an asexual. I'm okay with that. I'm mature enough to take it like an adult. But if your issue is with asexuals and you think it's productive to hate on asexuals or treat us like garbage, understand that your efforts are completely counterproductive if actually gender rights is what you care about and equality between men and women. The best way to achieve that is to avoid romantic or sexual behavior, because that's the source of gender roles ultimately, is that people engage in these sorts of relationships that introduce unnecessary transactional power dynamics, and that's why people behave the way that they do towards women and men and commit sexual violence in general, is because we treat sex as some kind of desirable commodity. This is relatively obvious to me, but for some reason it eludes a lot of people. I think more people ought to mention it. I fully accept that I will be discriminated against because of my opinion about sex as a meaningless and potentially even dangerous activity that should probably be advised against. A lot like playing with fireworks out in the park. It can be fun at first, but after a while you're going to burn some trees down and potentially kill someone. So unless it's the 4th of July, maybe you tamper it down a little and think about your behavior. I suppose Neil Gaiman doesn't operate with that mindset, because he's a weak and pathetic man who has never put out a book worth reading in his life. Let's be honest. His books are pretty ass. I think that's something that should be said about Neil Gaiman. Not only is he a morally bankrupt weasel who does whatever he feels like when the camera is turned off, but he's also a terrible writer. And ultimately, as someone who cares way more about art than sex, maybe he thought he was cool for having sex with so many young women or something, and he thought that people would give him props for that. I don't know what was going through his head when he did it. Probably just unrestrained primate behavior, animalistic grunts and the like. Ultimately, I think we ought to call out Neil Gaiman as a shallow writer before deriding his behavior in real life, because if you can't even turn out a book worth fucking reading, really, what value do you present to the world? I find it kind of disturbing, but a lot of men, especially my age and younger, tend to idolize figures like Justin Roiland, Neil Gaiman, etc., and we don't treat these things with nearly as much severity as we should. But I've found that, much like with fascists, who have extremely fragile egos, if you mock and belittle rapists, their egos also take a huge hit. So just remember, the greatest weapon against those who would abuse their power or their standing as men in an arbitrary gender binary where men are considered the superior gender or whatever is just to insult those in power or figures of authority. That diminishes their power substantially, because power is ultimately a human construct. People only have as much power as we afford them. If rapists are not respected or treated as worthy of consideration as human beings, but as animalistic primates who are only able to obey their genetic programming and listen to their horny brain, then I think we'll be living in a better society overall. I am kind of disturbed, though, by just how light we seem to treat people like Neil Gaiman. Like, the guy's thoroughly immoral, and I think that should be said. And if anyone wants to improve the speculative fiction landscape, they absolutely should not take issue with someone like me, because I spend all day writing, and I don't have the power or influence that Neil Gaiman does to do all the depraved shit he gets up to. I just spend all day fucking typing out novels, so there's no reason to discriminate against me. But that's the systems of power in play for you. They really disadvantage the people who deserve it, and they appease the people who don't. Anyway, I'd like to end this video on a positive note, so check this out. This is my brand new keyboard. This is the G413 TKL SE from Logitech. I got this at Micro Center today. My old keyboard was kind of wearing out. The USB connection was a little frayed. So I think I'm going to type out some fantastic new novels on this sucker. I can't wait. I'm going to be clicking and clacking away at this thing and writing way better books than Neil Gaiman ever could. So yeah, I'm glad I got this new keyboard. This makes me way happier than having sex. I can write now and express my feelings on paper. That's a fantastic ability that nobody should take for granted. Freedom of speech is important, remember, and if anyone tries to violate your rights, especially if you're a member of a discriminated minority, like asexuals, and you're disenfranchised by the world, don't feel like anyone has the power to take your voice away from you. That's the most important thing you have. And never be afraid to express yourself. That's very important, especially in today's climate, where fascist tendencies are growing steadily. And all we can hope to do is mock the people who abuse us.